introduce yourself, and then if you've brought others from the business that you want to introduce as well who won't be testifying, you can do that.
All right. Yeah, I'm Trevor Allard from Allard Lumber down in Brattleboro. Yes, my father's over here, Cliff Allard, who I'm sure will chime in at various times while I'm. So our mill, we've been in business since 1974. We saw around 10 million feet of mixed hardwood species, primarily hard and soft maple, with the more minor species being red oak, cherry ash, beech birch, mostly what's in the area. We have 4 now log procurement yards, West Pollitt, Vermont, Royalton, Vermont, Bristol, Vermont, and Haverhill, New Hampshire. So we're procuring about twice as many logs we're sawing, so close to 20 million feet, so we can get the ones we want to be sawing and the ones that are the most profitable. Total company, we have close to 60 employees now, ranging from, we have 1 mechanized logging crew. We have a large number of foresters in our log procurement department, licensed foresters, and then the actual mill and office staff. So tagging on from what Sam and Jack have been saying about the logging, that's trickled down to affect us also. We came out of this past terrible winter and we said, well, we squeaked by. As long as we have a good summer, everything will be all right. And of course, that hasn't happened. We've basically had the mill on reduced hours the entire summer. And then getting down into September, we started dropping Fridays additionally on top of our already reduced hours. And we basically have nothing in the yard right now to saw. Challenges of, we saw 5,000 board feet in an hour. So for us to change over to one particular species, we need to have enough of it in the yard that we can saw and at least saw it for a few hours. We're up to, at some points now, doing 3 or 4 species changes in a day just to keep the mill running, keep everybody employed. Beyond just the lost time, the logs we're sawing are not particularly profitable for us because we're scraping everything that we can from all of our our trading yards, our concentration yards, which then have additional trucking costs on top of them. And we're basically bringing everything in that even looks like a log. Stuff that we should be sawing and making or selling and making a little money on it, selling it out of the procurement yards. We're instead bringing to the mill and sawing it and not really making money on it. But again, we have almost 60 people working for us. We have to keep them employed and make sure they get their hours in so they can keep going. So it's been a tremendous effect on us, really. I mean, just like any other manufacturer, the mill's set up for us to run at 95+% capacity all the time. That's when we're the most efficient. That's when the overhead makes the most sense and when we can make the most money at it. So that's kind of been what our summer has been like. And I mean, we're now at the point coming into January, our lumber shed is empty. There's nothing left in it to sell. We've been the inventory's been going down all summer as we've had the reduced hours. So even though now it looks like we might actually have a stretch here of some decent logging weather, it's going to take us quite a while. Some of those logs, when they come in, from the time it's sawn, goes through our dry kiln process, and then gets through our dry shed to a point where we can sell it. I mean, on a quick drying species, we might be able to get it through in 3 or 4 weeks, 2 weeks of drying, and then through all the processing. On a species like red oak, if we're sawing thick lumber, I mean, that's 3 months from the time the log's sawn to the time we can actually sell it. If we've accumulated enough for a kiln charge, because we can't dry all the mixed species together, it has to be stuff that's can be compatibly dried together. So those challenges are going to affect us into the spring of this year, just while we're trying to, even if we get great logging from now through the whole winter, which we're all hoping for, that's still going to be an effect for us going through into the first quarter, probably into the second quarter of this year.
Trevor, can I just ask, and I want to keep an eye on the clock, could you give us a sense of who your customers are? Are they Vermont businesses? How are they being affected? Are they getting supplies elsewhere around the country? Because it's not just Vermont, obviously, that's experiencing the weather.
Yeah, much of the hardwood market is export. So we sell to some businesses, particularly some of the lower grade material, things that are going into items like pallets. That the other big one is the mill waste. So the chips and the sawdust and things like that come off the mill. It's become a really hot commodity now that we're going into winter, and because many of the operations that do chipping to feed the schools and other buildings, they don't have any chipwood in their yards yet because they haven't been able to buy it all summer. Same with most of the firewood processors. They just haven't been able to get anything. So we're having the phone ring off the hook. Everybody wants chips, but because we've had reduced hours, we don't have any chips to sell because we need them all to feed our boiler to dry lumber for us. So, I mean, a lot of the product goes, again, overseas, or a large amount of it's going into Canada. There hasn't been, which we would hope for, that corresponding shift in terms of the value of the lumber. It's just the way the market's been. It's been a tough lumber market the last year also, which has made it tougher to get through this because we can't just say, oh, we can just add 20% to the value of the lumber, right? Because we don't have any, but we really compete in a global market when it comes to lumber. So we just don't have that ability that it affects us that we can do that, fortunately.
Let's get one more question. Representative Templeman.
My question is kind of related. So it sounds like you're both involved in retail and wholesale.
We don't really do much retail. Most of our sales are by the tractor trailer load. Mm-hmm. That's just been the nature of our business. The retail's a tough animal, so to speak. And I get asked that a lot about local supply. Well, why can't you supply more local secondary contractors here? And basically it's because they're not there. There's just not, for the volume of lumber that we're producing. I mean, we're the biggest hardwood mill in the state, but by mill standards for even the Northeast, if you include just like the state of New York, we're fairly small. Putting out 45,000 a shift versus, I mean, there's mills in New York, they're putting out 100, 125, 150,000 board feet in one single shift. And it's just, again, it's too much for that secondary market to handle in Vermont. There's just not a lot of, I mean, I think like Maple Landmark, who makes all the toys and stuff down there, I think Mike told me he buys one trailer load a year of lumber or 1.5 of hard maple. But that's wonderful, but we will produce that in 3 hours.
That's actually helpful for context, so thank you. And yeah, go ahead, Jim.
Just another follow-up. How far does procurement sort of make sense with the economy? You know, would you start looking to the Berkshires or the Adirondacks or, White Mountains, or is it really a sort of local/regional business?
We generally say within 100 miles, but because it's Vermont, 100 miles doesn't always mean it's a quick trip either. So like the yard we just picked up in Royalton, that's 61 miles, and it's a nice, easy truck to get down. We're now buying logs into the old A. Johnson Bristol location, which is only 88 miles, but it's a hard 88 miles to get down here. So, and it depends what the logs are also. For a higher volume or something, or higher value log or something that we have a specialty on, we can haul it a little farther. But other logs, particularly if they're on the low grade side or if they're on the small side, I mean, we just can't. They basically have to come into the mill. Otherwise, we can't saw them because it's. So, I mean, a 60-mile truck like that, like the straight one, that's probably $85 a thousand. It adds to the cost of the logs to come in, which can be 20 or 30% additional cost on the logs, depending on what they are. So it's a problem. Everything has to come in pretty close. I mean, we're on the corner of 3 states down in Brattleboro. So obviously we're buying from 3 states and we get a little bit from New York, but not much just because you can't put a lot of logs on a truck. It'd be under 99,000.
Well, thank you, Trevor, and thank you for waiting patiently. And now the next person who's been waiting patiently, Oliver, you want to come up?
Thanks, Chair Durfee and members of the committee. For the record, my name is Oliver Pearson. I'm the director of the Forest Division within the Vermont Department of Forest Parks and Recreation. Here to really just make 2 points. One, to speak a little about the July storm impact and a survey we did to try to quantify those losses. Then talk a little bit about what we're doing to support the sector and lend some sort of support to some of the ideas that have already been shared this morning. So we certainly recognize the hard times that logging contractors had during the wet summer, the warm winter, and it's not just the July flooding, as has been said. This has been a consistent challenge over the last few years. And I think this storm had significant physical and economic impacts across Vermont. The story for the forestry operations is larger. It centers around changing climate, needing programs to help adapt and mitigate the losses to the industry, and possibly provide support for complying with water quality regulations or implementing best management practices, in a manner similar to what the state is providing to the agricultural sector. So the storm happened. In response to that, we did do a survey of all the forest economy businesses and landowners that were willing to respond to try to quantify the economic damage from the storm. We had 90 survey respondents, and our data showed that the economic losses to the sector were almost $3 million from just the July 10th flood. We believe that to be a very conservative number. We think that's an underestimate. It didn't sort of chronicle all the losses from the entire wet summer or even the difficult conditions before in the winter, but it sort of shows you that the storm had a significant impact on the sector, and logging contractors were the biggest piece of that, with a loss of $1.8 million from the storm. And this was business interruptions, not being able to get into the woods because it's too wet. And so it's not sort of loss of physical, not negative impacts on physical infrastructure, for which there's more types of support and recovery programs for. So I think, had we really want to call out that if we look back, loggers would have been normally in the woods harvesting during this period, but they're professionals. They're following the water quality regulations, are doing their best to. So they stay at home, look for other things to do, as you've heard. And those that do get out, as you've heard, complying with the regulations is expensive. So there's a significant burden there. And then it's important to understand the ripple effects that the storm caused. If the wood's not coming out, it's not getting trucked, it's not getting to the mills, getting to manufacturers, decreasing supply, and all the businesses along the supply chain suffer. And then, as has been said, making the recovery more challenging for logging contractors. I would agree with what's been said. All the assistance programs offering recovery after the July storm were for physical damages and not for business interruption. The NRCS, Natural Resource Conservation Service, had one program that offered some assistance for forest lands, but that was for landowners to do things like rebuild roads, and didn't support contractors that were unable to work. So these challenges are real, and it's expected that this type of operations interruptions will continue, and forest access conditions will continue to be limited by wetter summers, warmer winters. And so in the Department of Forest, Parks and Rec, we're really thinking about how do we consider these challenges, how do we address these challenges going forward, and what can we do to support a vibrant forest economy in Vermont going forward. So as you know, we've been developing the Vermont Forest Future Strategic Roadmap that's going to be available to the legislature very soon this month. And I think we've identified through that process that there is a need to support the industry in adopting resilient strategies to climate change. Some of those strategies are assisting forest products enterprises implement climate adapted practices, encouraging the installation of climate resilient infrastructure, promoting the use of logging equipment and techniques that reduce adverse impacts on soil and water quality, and implementing forest management research projects on state and municipal lands to make forests more resilient to the negative impacts of climate change. And there's some exciting projects going on that are going to achieve that. So on an example of the first, encouraging the installation of climate resilient infrastructure, we've been lucky to receive clean water funds to sort of address any water quality challenges coming out of logging operations. And we've done things like support loggers with portable skidder bridges to minimize negative impacts on water quality as they move through their job. That's a really important program. We want to expand it, but we're somewhat resource limited on doing that now. And so some of the discussions we've had in Representative Lipsky and Representative Sims' bills might increase our ability to provide that type of support. We're also trying to identify what are the high priority areas for erosion, for water quality degradation, where we could focus on infrastructure improvements, both on state lands and on private lands, and working with the clean water service providers to do that on private lands, and working with our own resources to try to do that on public lands, on state lands. And so we're trying to scale that work up to create better conditions so that the logging contractors can actually get out. Dana mentioned this idea of using the Clean Water State Revolving Fund to provide low interest loans qualified loggers to purchase and use equipment that will have less of an impact on soils and negative impacts on water quality. And I would agree with what he said. We're looking into that. I think that if we can show that the demand is there and we can show that there's a clean water benefit, both of which I think we can, that's the type of program we can stand up and provide that financing to interested members of the sector to purchase those equipment. So that's something we're working on with DEC. And I think I'm optimistic we can get it into the intended use plan for the Clean Water State Revolving Fund by the midpoint of this year, so the funds could start to flow thereafter. I want to just acknowledge what Representative Lipsky said about one of the studies, the proposed economic impact and workforce availability study in this bill here that's on the wall.
Oliver, I'm just going to cut you off.
Sure.
Just because we haven't had.
Oh, sorry.
chance
Okay.
as a committee, had that bill introduced to us yet. And
Yeah.
really, it's probably not appropriate to be decussing it as we have. So,
Understood.
yeah, we'd
Oh.
be happy to hear any other thoughts that you have, though, from the department's perspective on the events that have happened up to now.
Well, I think that's where we certainly corroborate what you've heard from the members of the logging sector vis-a-vis the negative economic impacts caused by the storm. We're using some of our existing programs to try to address that. We're hoping to scale that up. And I think looking at the clean water funds, which have supported us up till now, and trying to build on the work that's been achieved to date, but scale that up will be really critically important going forward. And so we're in discussions with the Department of Environmental Conservation to try to achieve that. So I think I'll stop there and happy to take any questions.
Okay, let me just see if there's any committee member questions first. And I have one question, but if nobody else does. I think it was Sam mentioned earlier that in theory, landowners, possibly loggers, were able to benefit from the BGAP funding based on wood that had been cut, logs that were on the ground. And I'm wondering if that actually happened at all, if you're aware of any loggers or landowners or.
Yeah, I'm familiar with the BGAP program, but I'm not familiar with any specific examples of where members of the sector in the state were able to benefit from that. We have had applications for that NRCS program that I mentioned. Sam, go ahead.
Mr. Chair,
Sam.
thank you. I that was, as we examined all the BGAP opportunities, that was the one thread we could find where someone could apply, but I am not aware of a single landowner or logging contractor that applied for or received those funds. So it would have been very difficult to have provided a credible demonstration of the exact value. It would have been an enormous effort to do that. But it was just one example we could come up with that people might be able to apply for.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I see Mr. Allard has his hand up, and I don't know if you had a question or wanted.
I'm going to add to Trevor's discussion. You really missed a couple of things.
You want to come up to you want to? Yes.
When we had that rain this spring, it was just, I think it was very late June, whatever it was. The ground had just started to dry out and look pretty nice. We had 8 crews out logging. And the next day, we had none. We had, since there's several of them that were just, you couldn't even pick the equipment up and move it was so bad. And it was just dead stop. You know, while they're fixing the roads, patch it all back together. The town roads, so it'd be even more. And the trucks, we have 3 trucks, we have 2 tractors, a log truck. And one of them was set half the summer not being worked. It just didn't have to do it. It just isn't worth it.
Yeah, I think for some conditions, not incredibly wet conditions, but for moderately wet conditions, the strategies are there. Culverts, hardened landings, skidder bridges, buffers, but there's costs associated with implementing all of those for the contractors. And we are beginning to look at how to defray some of those costs through some of the clean water programs we have, but our funding is inadequate to do that at the scale that's needed.
I mean, you could spend $1,000, $1,500 just moving the equipment from one job to another, then preparing the landing, hoping it can go. And it works against it.
Representative O'Brien.
Just, not only are you sort of watching other loggers' jobs, but you're also the steward of the state forest. So just from that perspective, if you have jobs that should have been done
Yeah.
not been done.
Last year, we only put out 4 or 5 timber sales on state lands, which is a reduction compared to previous years. That's partially because of the climate change and the soil moisture conditions. There were some other factors as well. Our loggers spent a lot of time doing road erosion inventories last year because we were fortunate to get some ARPA funds to improve roads. So we had guys that usually cruise timber, looking at culverts and measuring road angles and that sort of thing. But we definitely were impacted by the wet conditions in terms of timber sales on state lands as well. And I think we look at the flood as a business interruption for state lands as well. And that impacts the small businesses that typically bid and sign contracts with the state to remove the timber, to harvest the timber and get that off our land. So it's certainly felt on state lands. And we have long-range management plans that you're probably aware of where we're a bit behind. I just say we're a bit behind schedule on implementation as a result.
We had another witness on the list who I think may have dropped off, Sam, from Zoom, unless
It's a Gilman.
Melanie, yeah. Melanie? Not there. I had heard that she had maybe had to drop off, so, yes, Dan.
Could I just offer one kind of expanded view of the economic impact numbers that Oliver found through their survey. So I think, Oliver, you mentioned 1.8 million directly to loggers.
Directly to loggers, correct.
And then about $5 million overall from what you know that.
Three. Yep.
So through the University of Maine efforts that I mentioned when we did our economic impact studies, generally you multiply direct impact by 2.5 to determine the overall economic impact. That's direct, indirect, kind of all the way down through the chain. So if you take the numbers that Oliver mentioned, you multiply them by 2.5, and then you're extrapolating out that the logging community, only the logging community, is over $4 million. And you take that $3 million and now you're up to about $7.5 million. So that's direct, but then you have to add that 2.5 indirect to get the overall economic impact. And now we're starting to talk about some real numbers, because remember, it's not just about wage replacement. It's also about what's spent on fuel, what is spent on that goes into the local stores, what goes in and then starts to circulate from everybody. So now you're talking about real numbers that I think impacts a lot more than just the wage replacement.
Thank you, Sam.
Thank you. And as Mr. Pearson indicated, the very conservative estimates of the survey. I contributed help with the survey questions, and one of the things is we looked at $100,000 as the max. We did brackets 10,000, 50,000, 75,000. Talked about 100,000. We debated $200,000 maximum amount of losses. It ended up at 100,000. That resulted in that $1.8 million. I know individual businesses that lost $400,000 in the month of July, logging contractors, and that's just the month of July. So when we talk about that being conservative, it's extremely conservative.
And then if someone said I'm in the $25,000 to $50,000 bracket, we use the lower end of that to estimate. So it is a very conservative estimate.
Is that, maybe you've already submitted that, but if you haven't, if the survey results are in the.
Yep, I can leave it here. Yep. It's on our website as well. I'll leave it with the committee.
Thank you. Okay, any other questions? We're at 12 or about at 12, so maybe we should stop there then. Committee's coming back at 1 this afternoon. We'll be continuing to talk about flood impact, but back on the agriculture side this afternoon. Thank you, everybody, for your time this morning.
Thank you.